A war veteran thought his grandfather's island was worthless, until his dog dug up the secret the government buried for 70 years. He thought his grandfather's island was nothing but rock and weeds, until his loyal dog unearthed the secret the government had buried for 70 years. This is the story of Ethan Brooks, a war veteran haunted by his past, and Scout, the dog who never left his side. Together, they uncovered what should have stayed buried and what it truly means to keep a promise. Before the story begins, tell me in the comments, where are you watching from tonight? Drop your city, your state, or just a 1 if you're listening beside the fire with us. Rain had a way of making the world quieter, but inside the small rented house on the edge of Portland, it only made the silence heavier. The drops rolled down the cracked window pane, each one carrying the dull reflection of a man who hadn't really been living for years.
I remember this day.
Ethan Brooks sat hunched at the table,
It was just after the
a chipped
war.
mug of coffee cooling between his hands. Beside him, Scout, the tan and black Malinois that had followed him home from a rescue unit overseas, lay with his head on his paws, ears twitching at every distant roll of thunder. The place smelled faintly of old wood and damp carpet. The TV flickered with static light, muted on the news channel he never watched anymore. The captions talked about an approaching storm on the Washington coast. Ethan didn't care. He had long ago stopped thinking about the future. Sleep had been a stranger for months. When it did come, it came with screams. Sand and fire, broken radios, the weight of a friend bleeding out in his arms. Scout always woke him before he lost control, pressing his nose against Ethan's chest until the shaking stopped. Tonight would be no different, he thought. The sound of rain on the roof mimicked the rattle of gunfire too well. He rubbed his temples and stared at the clutter of bills spread across the table. Rent, utilities, medical, all stamped with red letters. He'd worked construction for a while after leaving the service, then security at a warehouse. But the nightmares and the panic attacks had a way of making employers rethink staffing. He'd learned to live small, 1 room, 1 dog, 1 day at a time. A knock came, soft, hesitant. Ethan froze. He wasn't expecting anyone. Scout rose instantly, tail stiff, head tilted toward the door. When Ethan opened it, the rain swept in sideways, cold and metallic. The mail carrier handed him a heavy cream envelope, already spotted with water. "Certified delivery," the man said. "Had to be signed for." Ethan scrawled his name, shut the door, and stared at the envelope. It bore the seal of Lawson and Reed Law Firm, Seattle. He frowned. He didn't know anyone in Seattle. Didn't know anyone much at all. The handwriting on the front was neat, deliberate. Scout sniffed at it, giving a low growl deep in his chest. "Easy, boy," Ethan murmured. "It's just paper." But his own gut didn't feel easy either. Something about the weight of the envelope felt wrong, like holding a memory that wasn't his. He slid it open with the dull edge of a knife. Inside were 2 sheets of thick paper and a return envelope. The first line caught his breath. "Dear Mr. Brooks, we are writing to inform you that you have been named the sole heir to the estate of the late Henry A. Brooks of Rootservie Island, Washington State." He read it twice, lips barely moving. Henry Brooks, his grandfather, a man whose name was more ghost than blood. He'd heard it only once from his father, and it had come out like a curse. Henry had been a Navy engineer during the Cold War, a man obsessed with his work and secrecy. Ethan's father had left home young, swearing never to set foot on that island again. Ethan stared at the signature at the bottom. Richard Lawson, attorney at law. He felt Scout nudge his arm, as if to say something. "What do you think, huh?" he said quietly. "Some mix-up? Maybe they got the wrong Brooks." But there was an attachment. A second page, a formal deed listing coordinates. an island parcel on a lake north of Puget Sound. The legalese was dry, impersonal, but one sentence near the bottom made him pause. Property has been maintained in trust since the passing of Mr. Henry Brooks. Transfer of ownership requires on-site acknowledgement by the heir. He folded the papers, staring at the rain. Outside, the street lamps bled gold into puddles. He should throw it away. He didn't have money for gas, didn't have the will for ghosts. But then Scout growled again, sharp and focused this time, eyes fixed on the door as if something unseen waited beyond it. "Relax, buddy." Ethan crouched and ran a hand over the dog's head. "There's nothing out there." But Scout didn't relax. His ears twitched, nose flaring toward the window. Ethan followed his gaze. The street was empty except for a dark sedan idling across the road. Its lights were off, windows fogged. After a few seconds, it eased forward and disappeared into the rain. He watched it go, a strange chill working down his spine. "Okay," he muttered. "That's weird." He looked again at the letter. The words "on-site acknowledgement" lingered in his mind. Maybe it was the restlessness, the same itch that had driven him through a dozen tours and across half the world. Maybe it was the way Scout's eyes seemed to question him now, waiting for a command. "Washington," he whispered, testing the word. The idea sounded absurd, but it stirred something under the exhaustion, a faint pulse of curiosity, maybe even purpose. He sat down again, read the letter one more time, and stared at the last line. "We advise the heir to complete inspection before the coming season due to forecasted conditions." Outside, the thunder cracked, close enough to shake the walls. Scout jumped up, barking once. Ethan set the papers aside, exhaled, and stared at the rain tracing its slow, uneven patterns down the glass. For the first time in a long while, the noise didn't sound like gunfire. It sounded like something calling him home, though he didn't yet know to what. He reached down, scratched behind Scout's ear, and said softly, "Looks like we've got a road trip ahead of us, partner." Scout wagged his tail once, as if he'd known all along. By dawn, the storm had thinned into a gray drizzle. Ethan loaded what little he owned into the back of his old Jeep Cherokee. Some clothes, a half-empty toolbox, a first aid kit, and Scout's worn-out leash that he rarely used. The smell of wet asphalt and pine hung in the air. When the engine coughed to life, Scout jumped into the passenger seat and settled with his head out the window, the rain tapping lightly on his fur. The city fell away quickly. Mile after mile, the highway stretched north, flanked by dark evergreens that rose like walls. The radio played an AM weather report. Heavy rain and coastal winds expected through the San Juan region this week. Mariners should take caution near smaller islands. Ethan glanced at the map on the seat. Brooks Island sat in a tiny cluster near the upper left corner of Washington, barely a speck. He had never heard of it before the letter. Now it was the only thing he could think about. Scout shifted restlessly as the Jeep climbed into the mist. Ethan rolled down the window for air. The scent of salt reached them long before they saw the ocean. It hit him with a kind of memory that wasn't his, maybe something carried through the family line. They stopped at a gas station outside Astoria, Oregon. Ethan filled the tank and stood under the small canopy watching the rain sweep across the bridge ahead. A man in an old raincoat beside him nodded politely. "Headed north?" "Yeah," Ethan replied. "Bad weather up that way," the man said. "You might want to hole up before you take the ferry." Ethan gave a polite nod. "Appreciate it." Back in the car, Scout let out a low chuff, almost like agreement. "I know," Ethan said. "Feels like we're driving into something, doesn't it?" The road narrowed to 2 lanes bordered by moss-covered rails. The fog grew thicker, curling around the hood like smoke. Scout's ears twitched. Every time Ethan glanced at him, the dog was watching the trees slide by, as if searching for something unseen. By the time they reached the small harbor town of Ulu, daylight had faded into a dull silver gloom. The place looked forgotten. Half the storefronts boarded up, an old bar with its neon light buzzing faintly, and the scent of brine in every gust of wind. Ethan parked by a diner with a sagging roof and led Scout inside. The bell over the door gave a tired jingle. Only one man sat behind the counter, wiping glasses with a cloth that looked older than the sign outside. He was in his late 60s, with a face weathered like driftwood. "Coffee?" the man asked. "Black," Ethan said. The man poured and eyed Scout. "Fine-looking dog. Service-trained?" "Yeah," Ethan said quietly. "Saved my life more than once." The man nodded slowly. "They always do." They sat in silence for a while. The rain thudded against the windows like a heartbeat. Then Ethan said, "You ever heard of a place called Brooks Island?" The man froze mid-wipe. His gaze lifted, sharp now. "Can't say that name's come up in a long while." "It was my grandfather's," Ethan explained. "Henry Brooks." The old man put down the glass, leaning on the counter. "Henry? Yeah, I remember him. Used to come through here for supplies. Always alone. Quiet sort of man. Folks said he was keeping watch over something up there." Ethan frowned. "Keeping watch?" "Mm-hmm. Didn't talk much, but he had that look, like he'd seen too much of the world to trust it anymore." The man hesitated, then reached under the counter and came up with a small, rusted key on a chain. "He left this here years ago. Said someone would come asking one day. Said I'd know by the eyes." Ethan blinked. "The eyes?" The man shrugged. "Guess he was right." He slid the key forward across the counter. Ethan turned it in his palm. The metal was cold, the number 17 etched into one side. "What's it open?" "Don't know," the man said. "Maybe the island. Maybe the past. Either way, it'll find you." Outside, the rain had stopped. The clouds hung low, swollen and gray. Ethan slipped the key into his jacket pocket and paid for the coffee. The man didn't count the change. As Ethan stepped out, the old man called after him, "You be careful, son. Some places remember what people forget." The words followed him to the jeep like a ghost. The harbor road curved down toward the docks where a few old boats knocked softly against their ropes. Ethan booked passage on a small ferry scheduled for the next morning. "Brooks Island?" the captain repeated when he asked. "That place still belongs to somebody?" "Apparently," Ethan said. The captain gave a low whistle. "Only a few 100 yards across, but deep water all around. I don't go too close after dark." Ethan forced a small smile. "Good thing it'll be daylight then." That night, he and Scout stayed in a rundown motel overlooking the water. The heater clicked and rattled. Outside, gulls screamed over the tide. Ethan sat on the edge of the bed, reading the letter from Lawson and Reed again under the weak light of a bedside lamp. Scout lay near the door, eyes half open, listening. "You ever think we're just meant to keep chasing the same ghosts?" Ethan asked quietly. Maybe he was too. Scout gave a soft whine and thumped his tail against the carpet. Ethan smiled faintly. "Yeah, you're probably right. No one's meant to stay lost forever." He closed his eyes, letting the sound of the waves fill the room. The rhythm of it reminded him of breath, steady, patient, eternal. The island was waiting out there somewhere in the mist, holding its secret. And for the first time in years, Ethan felt a direction pulling him forward instead of back. He didn't dream that night. When morning came, the world was silver. A fog so thick it seemed alive drifted over the harbor, swallowing the masts and rooftops in a wet hush. Ethan zipped up his jacket, slung his pack over one shoulder, and opened the motel door. Scout trotted out first, nose lifted, tail low but steady. The air smelled of salt, rust, and pine, like something ancient that never left. The ferry was a small one, just big enough for 3 cars and a handful of passengers. The captain, a broad man in a green raincoat, was coiling rope when Ethan and Scout arrived. "You the one heading for Brooks Island?" he asked, squinting through the fog. "That's right. Not many folks go there anymore. Some say it's cursed." Ethan gave a half smile. "Everywhere I've been was cursed." The captain chuckled and waved them aboard. "Suit yourself, soldier." Scout settled near the railing as the ferry pushed off. The sound of the engine hummed beneath their feet, blending with the cry of gulls hidden in the fog. Ethan leaned on the cold metal rail, staring into the white nothing ahead. He tried to picture what the island might look like, his grandfather's island, but all he saw was an endless sheet of mist and water. Halfway across, the fog began to thin. A dark shape took form, a ridge of trees, then the sharp edge of a roofline, a single chimney jutting toward the gray sky. The captain pointed. "That's her, Brooks Island." Ethan's breath caught slightly. The island wasn't large, just a hump of rock and pine sitting in the middle of a deep, still lake, but it had a gravity to it, like it had been waiting a long time for someone to return. When they docked, the wooden pier creaked underfoot. The air was cooler here, and the smell of wet soil and cedar was stronger. Scout sniffed the ground, his ears alert. "Need a pickup time?" the captain asked. Ethan shook his head. "Not yet. I'll signal when I'm ready." "All right then. Watch your step. The place can be strange after dark." The ferry engine roared to life again, fading into the mist as it pulled away. Soon, the only sounds were the soft lap of waves and the whisper of wind through the trees. Ethan turned toward the shore. The house stood about 50 yards inland, hidden behind a fringe of birch and pine. The path leading up was choked with moss and roots, and every step made the boards of the pier groan as if the island itself was waking. The house was smaller than he'd imagined. 2 stories, weather-beaten, its once white paint now the color of old bones. The windows were clouded with dust, the porch half collapsed. A single rocking chair sat on its side near the doorway. He paused before stepping in, scanning the yard. An old generator sat under a tarp by the shed, long dead. A rusted weather vane creaked overhead. Scout barked once, then went silent. Ethan turned the doorknob. It gave easily. The smell hit him first. Dust, damp wood, and something faintly metallic. Inside, light filtered weakly through dirty windows, catching on floating dust motes. Everything was coated in a thin film of gray. A table sat in the center of the room, papers scattered across it. Tools, bolts, a magnifying lens. Along one wall, a bookshelf sagged under the weight of manuals. U.S. Navy engineering standards, fuel line schematics, 1950s field notes. Scout wandered ahead, sniffing the corners, tail low but wagging. "Easy, boy," Ethan said softly. "It's just us." He found the living room nearly intact. A kettle still hung beside an old wood stove. On the mantel above it sat a small photo in a cracked frame. 2 men standing beside a boat, one of them unmistakably his grandfather, the other too young to identify. The water behind them looked eerily like the same lake outside. Ethan set the frame down gently, the weight of memory pressing on his chest. In the study, he found drawers full of notebooks and maps, each page dense with numbers and coordinates. Most of it he couldn't make sense of. But one map caught his attention. It was hand-drawn, the lines trembling slightly, marking the outline of the island. Near the bottom, in faded pencil, a single phrase was written: "Where the water never rests." Ethan traced the words with his thumb. It sounded like a riddle, or maybe a warning. A sudden thump echoed from upstairs. Scout's head snapped toward the sound, ears up, body tense. Ethan froze, listening. The house settled with a slow creak. He told himself it was just wind, but the noise had a rhythm, 2 steps, then one more, as if someone, or something, was moving. He grabbed the flashlight from his pack and climbed the stairs quietly, his boots barely brushing the dust-covered boards. The hallway smelled faintly of mildew. Doors lined both sides, some open, others closed tight. Scout stayed close, muscles coiled. At the far end, a door stood half open. Ethan pushed it with the flashlight beam, revealing an attic staircase. He hesitated, then climbed. The steps groaned under his weight. The attic was small, its slanted roof patched with sunlight leaking through broken shingles. Old trunks and fishing nets filled one corner. In another stood a wooden desk with papers strewn across it. On top lay a leather-bound notebook. He flipped it open. The handwriting was neat but faded. The first page read, Henry A. Brooks, 1953, Personal Observations, Lake Route Survey Project. The entries that followed were meticulous, records of tides, chemical samples, and machinery inspections. But as the pages went on, the writing grew unsteady, frantic. They said the tests were halted. They lied. Something still moves beneath the lake. I hear it when the wind dies. The water never sleeps. Ethan's pulse quickened. He scanned the rest, but the last pages were smeared, as if water had soaked through them long ago. Behind him, Scout whined softly. The dog's gaze was fixed on a corner of the attic, where an old trunk sat half open. Ethan knelt and lifted the lid. Inside, under layers of cloth, he found a small steel box. It was locked, but the rusted key from the old man's diner fit perfectly. The lock clicked open with a hollow sound. Inside were several folded documents and a compass with the initials HB engraved on the back. One of the papers was an old Navy blueprint marked Restricted. Another was a photograph, his grandfather standing beside what looked like a hatch built into the rocky shore. In the background, the lake shimmered like dark glass. Ethan's stomach tightened. The same words appeared scrawled on the back of the photo. The water never rests. He looked out the cracked attic window. Below, the lake stretched gray and endless, its surface rippling though there was no wind. Scout gave a low growl, and Ethan felt the hair rise on his arms. Something about this place was alive, not just in memory, but in the quiet, watchful way the earth itself sometimes waits. He closed the box, tucking it under his arm. "Come on, boy," he said. "Let's see what else this island's hiding." Scout followed, tail flicking once before disappearing down the stairs into the dark. Outside, the gray light of late afternoon was already fading. The air smelled of pine and rain, and the lake beyond the window glimmered like a sheet of steel. Ethan spent the next few hours sweeping dust, clearing the hearth, and checking the roof for leaks. The rhythm of work steadied him, dulled the memories clawing at the back of his mind. Scout stayed close, padding from room to room, sniffing corners like a sentry on patrol. Every creak of the old house made him glance toward the door. Ethan told himself the dog was just getting used to the new place, but deep down he felt it too, that uneasy hum in the air, like the island itself was listening. By nightfall, the sky had turned the color of ash. Wind hissed through the birches. Ethan set up a small camp bed near the fireplace, fed the stove with wood from the shed, and sat down to eat a can of soup warmed over the flames. Scout curled up nearby, head resting on his paws, eyes half open. The steel box from the attic sat on the table beside him. Its surface caught the light of the fire, the engraving on the compass glinting faintly. He'd read every page inside twice already. The technical sketches were beyond him, but the fear in his grandfather's words wasn't. He recognized it too well. He poured a bit of water into Scout's bowl and said, "Looks like he was trying to protect something, huh? Not just himself." Scout raised his head at the sound of his voice, then turned toward the window. The wind outside shifted, low, dragging, almost like movement through the grass. Ethan's hand paused halfway to the bowl. He heard it too. A crunch. Then another. He set the bowl down slowly, reached for the flashlight on the table, and stood up. Scout was already alert, muscles tight, nose pointed toward the door. Ethan whispered, "Stay." But Scout ignored him, padding silently across the floor. When Ethan opened the door, cold air rushed in. The forest beyond was a blur of black trunks and drifting mist. Rain had started again, fine and sharp as needles. He swept the flashlight beam over the porch, the yard, the edge of the trees. Nothing. Just the wind bending branches. Then Scout growled, a low, warning sound that rumbled in his chest. He was staring toward the back of the house. Ethan followed the line of the dog's gaze and saw it. The cellar door, swaying open in the wind. He was sure he'd latched it earlier. "Damn it," he muttered, stepping down into the mud. The air down there smelled of rust and rot. The flashlight beam caught the slick curve of the cellar steps descending into shadow. "Scout, stay," he said again, but the dog followed anyway, close on his heel. The cellar was small, its concrete floor wet from seepage. Tools hung rusted on the wall, shelves sagged under old jars and cans. In the corner stood a heavy door, metal, industrial, the kind you didn't find in ordinary houses. It was slightly ajar. Ethan's breath hitched. He moved closer, the beam of his flashlight trembling across the surface. A set of fingerprints gleamed faintly in the dust. Fresh. He pushed the door open with the edge of his boot. Beyond it stretched a short tunnel lined with corrugated steel. The air was colder here, heavy with a faint hum that he could feel more than hear. Scout hesitated, then pressed forward, nose twitching. Ethan followed, counting his steps. 10 feet in, the tunnel ended at a wall of rock where a small hatch had been welded shut. Across the surface, someone had painted in faded red letters, "Keep closed." He ran his fingers over the seam of the hatch, cold, smooth, undisturbed for decades, until now. A thin trail of muddy water seeped from underneath, glinting under the light. Scout growled again, then barked sharply, once. The sound echoed down the tunnel, swallowed by the dark. Ethan took a slow breath. "All right," he murmured. "We're not opening anything tonight." They backed out carefully, sealing the metal door behind them. As soon as it latched, the wind outside rose into a long, hollow wail, shaking the house above their heads. By the time they made it back upstairs, the storm had grown teeth. Rain hammered the roof, and the lake beyond the trees churned under whitecaps. Lightning flashed, lighting up the room for a single heartbeat. In that instant, Ethan saw something just outside the window. A shape, human, standing still in the rain. He spun toward it, but the next flash showed only the birch trees, their branches whipping in the wind. Scout barked furiously, front paws against the glass. Ethan grabbed his rifle from the corner and opened the door again, heart pounding. "Hey!" he shouted into the storm. "Who's out there?" The only answer was the wind. He stepped onto the porch, scanning the tree line. The rain soaked through his jacket instantly. The flashlight beam cut across the yard and stopped. Footprints. Deep, fresh, leading toward the lake. He followed them a few yards until they vanished at the water's edge. The surface of the lake rippled as if something had just slipped beneath it. Scout whined, tugging back toward the house. Ethan's pulse thudded in his ears. He swept the light across the shore again, but the prints were already filling with rain. They retreated inside. Ethan locked the door, shoved a chair against it, and stood still for a moment, listening. Only the storm, only the sound of his own breath. Scout pressed against his leg, trembling, not in fear, but in readiness. "It's all right, boy," Ethan whispered, though he didn't believe it. "We'll figure it out in the morning." He stirred the fire, added another log, and lay down on the cot, the rifle within reach. Scout lay beside him, eyes open toward the window. The storm raged for hours, shaking the island like a living thing. Sometime near dawn, Ethan drifted into uneasy sleep, his mind filled with fragments. His grandfather's face from the photo, the painted warning on the hatch, the reflection of a figure vanishing into rain. When he woke, the fire had died. The air was cold and gray again. Scout sat at the door, staring out at the lake. Ethan followed his gaze. The storm had passed, but the water still moved strangely, swirling in slow circles near the dock. He rubbed his tired eyes and whispered, "The water never rests." Scout turned to him, ears pricked, as if the dog understood the weight of the words. Something about this island, Ethan thought, didn't want to be forgotten. The morning light was thin and pale, filtered through a sky still bruised from the night's storm. The air outside smelled of wet pine and lake water. Ethan stood on the porch with a mug of coffee, his mind looping back to the footprints, the open cellar, the figure he thought he saw by the water. The island was empty, he told himself. It had to be. But that didn't make him feel any less watched. Scout sat beside him, tail flicking in the damp air, gaze fixed on the tree line. Every few seconds, his ears would twitch toward some distant sound Ethan couldn't hear. "Still thinking about last night?" Ethan said quietly. "Yeah, me too." After breakfast, he went back down to the cellar. The door was still locked, the metal cold to the touch. No new footprints, no sign of entry. It was as if the storm had erased everything except the questions in his head. He spent the rest of the morning exploring the property. The house stood near the southern ridge, overlooking the lake. A few hundred yards behind it lay an old shed, half buried in ivy. Its door was swollen shut from years of rain. Ethan pried it open with a crowbar and stepped inside. The smell hit him first. Oil, dust, and rusted metal. Sunlight leaked through holes in the roof, illuminating rows of shelves stacked with jars, tools, and boxes. Scout trotted in after him, nose working the ground. Something about the place felt untouched, frozen in time. On the back wall, Ethan noticed a section of floorboards darker than the rest. When he pressed his boot against one, it shifted slightly. He crouched, scraped away the dirt, and found a round outline of metal beneath. A handle. "Hold on, boy," he murmured. He cleared the debris and pulled. The small hatch resisted at first, then gave way with a shriek of rusted hinges. A cool breath of air drifted up from below. Inside was a shallow compartment, a hidden space beneath the floor. A metal case rested inside, about the size of a toolbox, its surface speckled with corrosion. Ethan hauled it out and set it on a workbench. The lock had rusted through years ago. One twist of his knife popped it open. Inside lay a stack of rolled papers tied with string, a pocket compass, and a few black and white photographs. He unrolled the first paper and froze. Blueprints. Lines, numbers, and annotations filled the page in his grandfather's precise handwriting. It wasn't a house design. It was something else. Something industrial. The title block in the corner read, Project Tide. Fuel Containment and Test Facility, 1952. Ethan's heart thudded. He flipped through the rest. Diagrams of underground tunnels, power grids, reinforced walls. There were coordinates scribbled in the margins, a rough sketch of the lake, and an arrow pointing to a spot near the shore labeled Secondary. "Hatch!" Scout barked suddenly, breaking the silence. Ethan looked up. The dog stood at the doorway, ears pricked, tail rigid. "What is it?" Scout barked again, louder. Ethan grabbed the flashlight from his belt and stepped outside. The forest beyond the clearing was still, except for the whisper of wind through wet branches. He followed Scout around the side of the shed, scanning the ground. Mud, moss, puddles, then something metallic glinting near the roots of a tree. It was a shovel. A new one. Too clean to have been left there for decades. Ethan's stomach tightened. Someone else had been digging here recently. He glanced back toward the lake. From this angle, he could see faint tire marks in the mud near the old dock. Fresh ones. He felt the old soldier's instinct kick in. The one that told him when things weren't right. Whoever had come here during the night hadn't been scared off by the storm. They'd been looking for something. He tucked the blueprints under his arm and headed back inside. The papers were damp now, edges curling. He spread them across the table and took photos with his phone. The coordinates, numbers, and letters didn't make sense on their own, but he recognized a pattern. Longitude, latitude. He opened his map app and entered them. The red marker appeared less than 100 yards from the cabin, right near the spot where he'd seen the strange ripples that morning. Of course, he muttered. The lake. He dialed the only number he trusted. Tom Harris. It rang twice before a familiar voice came through, rough and steady. Brooks? Haven't heard that name in a while. Ethan exhaled, feeling tension leave his shoulders for the first time all day. Yeah, it's me. Well, hell, I thought you fell off the map. What's going on? I might have stepped onto one instead, Ethan said. I'm on an island my grandfather owned. I found something. Blueprints, Navy stuff, early Cold War, marked Project Tide. The line went quiet. Then Tom's tone changed. Say that again? Project Tide, fuel containment, 1952. Ring any bells? A pause. More than you want it to. That name came up in declassified chatter a few years back. Unofficial Navy experiment, probably nuclear-related. Then it vanished. Records scrubbed, personnel reassigned, even congressional oversight disappeared. They said it was canceled in '53. Well, looks like it wasn't, Ethan said. Tom swore under his breath. Brooks, listen to me. If your grandfather worked on that, he was sitting on something the government buried deep. You said you're on the property now? Yeah. Then you need to be careful. If those files still exist, you're not the only one who wants them. Ethan looked toward the lake through the window, the surface calm but unreadable. I think you're right. Don't send anything over the phone, Tom warned. Just keep those files safe. I'll start digging on my end and call you tomorrow. The call ended with a crackle. Scout was pacing now, restless. Ethan knelt and scratched behind his ear. We're not leaving yet, buddy. Not until we know what he was protecting. That evening, he sat by the fire again, studying the blueprints under lamplight. The sound of the lake outside had changed, softer now, like breathing under the floorboards. He found himself whispering the same words written on every page. The water never rests. Maybe his grandfather hadn't meant it as poetry. Maybe it was literal. Something beneath the island, beneath the lake, had never stopped moving. Scout raised his head suddenly, eyes catching the flicker of the fire. Ethan turned just in time to see a light flash once across the water, like a reflection or a signal. He froze, watching. There it was again. 2 short flashes, then darkness. He stood slowly, rifle within reach. Scout growled low, the sound rumbling through the quiet cabin. Whoever was out there, Ethan realized, wasn't just watching. They were sending a message, and he didn't know whether it was meant for him or for something still waiting below. The flashes from the lake haunted him through the night. Even after the fire burned low and Scout finally drifted to sleep, Ethan stayed by the window, eyes on the water. It stayed calm now, blank and dark, as though nothing had ever disturbed it. But in the silence, he could almost feel a pulse under the floorboards, a faint, rhythmic vibration. too steady to be the wind. By morning, a thin fog rolled back across the island. Ethan stepped outside, the air cold enough to bite his skin. Scout trotted ahead, sniffing along the path toward the dock. The boards were slick with dew, but in the mud nearby, fresh prints, boot prints, cut through the damp soil. He crouched down and touched one, still wet. Someone had been here within hours. "Come on, boy," he muttered. "Let's see who left them." He followed the trail along the shore until it ended abruptly near the dock. The water lapped quietly against the posts. A slick of oil shimmered on the surface, a sign of a boat's engine. Ethan straightened, scanning the horizon, and then he saw it. A small motorboat approaching from the mist, its bow cutting through the still water. It wasn't the ferry captain's boat. This one was newer, sleek, corporate, painted white. Scout growled low, a sound that rose from deep in his chest. Ethan waited as the boat slowed, bumping gently against the dock. A man in a dark gray jacket stepped out, one hand steadying his briefcase, the other raised in a polite wave. His hair was slicked back, his expression calm, professional. "Mr. Brooks?" he called. "Ethan Brooks?" Ethan didn't answer. He stood still, arms crossed, watching the man walk up the dock. "My name's Hale," the stranger continued. "Richard Hale. I represent Everline Energy Corporation. We've been trying to reach your family for some time." "Funny," Ethan said. "You found me without trying that hard." Hale smiled faintly, the kind of smile that never reached the eyes. "We keep track of our assets, Mr. Brooks. Your grandfather's property happens to sit on land our company's been surveying for years. We have a legitimate interest in purchasing it." "I'm not selling." "Of course," Hale replied smoothly. "But perhaps you should hear the offer before you decide. It's quite generous." Ethan shook his head. "You came out here in a storm to make a business offer?" "I came because timing matters," Hale said, stepping closer. "There are certain environmental concerns we'd prefer to resolve before the next quarter. The work your grandfather did here, it's of interest to us." Scout moved between them, his body stiff, teeth bared. Hale paused, then crouched slightly, hands open in mock friendliness. "Beautiful dog. Malinois, yes? Trained?" "More than you think," Ethan said. Hale straightened again, his calm never wavering. "Look, Mr. Brooks, I understand your hesitation. This island carries sentimental weight. But sentiment doesn't pay property tax. My company can take that burden off your hands." Ethan's voice was even. "This land's not for sale. Whatever you're looking for, it's staying buried." For a moment, Hale said nothing. The smile faded. He looked past Ethan toward the forest, where the fog drifted low through the pines. "Buried," he repeated quietly. Interesting choice of word. Then, as quickly as it had gone, the charm returned. "Well, if you change your mind, you'll find my card on your porch. We'll be in touch." He turned and walked back down the dock, his shoes barely making a sound on the wet boards. Ethan stood there until the motorboat's hum faded into the mist. Scout growled once more before sitting beside him, ears still pointed toward the water. "Yeah," Ethan said under his breath. "I don't trust him either." Back inside, the card waited on the porch exactly where Hale said it would. A simple white rectangle with embossed letters. Richard Hale Everline Energy Corporation, Regional Acquisitions Office, Seattle, WA. Ethan flipped it over. On the back, written in neat handwriting, were 2 words, "You'll understand." He burned it in the stove without another thought. That evening, he tried calling Tom again, but the signal was gone, just static and the hiss of dead air. He left a short message anyway. "Ran into someone. Name's Hale. Corporate type. Says they've got ties to my grandfather's work. Doesn't feel right. The line cut off before he could say more. The next day brought uneasy quiet. No boats, no signs of life beyond the trees. Ethan tried to distract himself by repairing the porch steps, anything to keep his hands busy. But as he worked, he kept catching flashes of movement from the corner of his eye. A shadow shifting behind a tree, a ripple across the lake. By noon, he'd had enough. He grabbed his binoculars and climbed the small ridge behind the cabin, Scout close behind. From there, he could see almost the entire island, the house, the dock, the woods curling around the lake like a ring. Nothing moved except the wind stirring the treetops. But then, something caught his eye. Near the northern shore, half hidden by reeds, a patch of ground looked disturbed, freshly dug, the earth darker than the rest. He adjusted the focus. There, in the center of the disturbed ground, something metallic glinted in the sunlight. He started toward it immediately. Scout ran ahead, tail high. When they reached the spot, Ethan saw what the reflection had been. A piece of metal pipe jutting out from the soil, capped and sealed with weld marks. He brushed the dirt away until faint lettering appeared on the surface. U.S. Navy property. Restricted access. Scout whined, circling the pipe, sniffing. Ethan followed the pipe's direction. It ran straight toward the water. The blueprints flashed in his mind. Fuel containment. Secondary hatch. Whatever lay beneath this island wasn't just buried. It was sealed. And Hale, somehow, knew it was here. That night, a different kind of storm came in. Not thunder, but wind, the kind that seemed to carry voices through the trees. Ethan sat by the fire, cleaning his rifle. Scout lay near the door, every muscle tense. "Feels like we've kicked a hornet's nest," Ethan said softly. Scout lifted his head, ears twitching. Ethan looked toward the window. Out beyond the glass, a faint light moved through the mist, steady this time, not flashing. A lantern? A flashlight? It drifted along the edge of the dock, then disappeared. He set the rifle aside, grabbed his jacket, and stepped onto the porch. The air was cold, the kind that carried sound clearly. He listened. Somewhere near the dock, a single splash echoed, followed by silence. He walked slowly toward the water, boots crunching over gravel. Scout followed, low and quiet. When they reached the shoreline, Ethan scanned the dock with his flashlight. Nothing. Just wet boards and drifting fog. Then Scout stiffened, nose pointing toward something under the dock. Ethan crouched and aimed the light downward. A metal briefcase lay half submerged in the shallows, wedged between the posts. Its latch was broken. Inside he could see papers, half soaked but still intact. He reached down carefully and pulled it free. Stamped across the top of every page were the words, "Everline Energy, Internal Memorandum." And beneath it, in small print, subject, Recovery Operation, Brooks Island Test Site. Ethan's grip tightened around the papers. He looked back at the lake, where the fog swirled slowly over the surface, hiding everything beneath. Now he knew. Hale wasn't here to buy the island. He was here to dig it up. Ethan stood on the dock, the wet briefcase dripping lake water onto his boots. The fog thickened again, closing in around him until the world shrank to a circle of gray no wider than his flashlight beam. Scout pressed close to his leg, uneasy. The wind off the water carried the faint metallic smell of rain and something older, something that reminded Ethan of engine oil and salt. He opened the briefcase under the cabin's porch light. Inside were pages stamped confidential and signed by Everline's board of directors. The top sheet read, Operation Recovery, authorized entry for reclamation of legacy Navy project. Site coordinates, Brooks Island, Lake Rutservi. Objective, retrieve containment unit and remaining test materials. The rest was soaked, the ink bleeding into black veins across the paper. But one line near the bottom stayed clear. If local resistance is encountered, proceed under authority of Environmental Reclamation Order. Local resistance. That meant him. Ethan slammed the case shut. The thought of Hale and his men tearing into the island, digging through the soil where his grandfather's guilt still slept, lit a fire inside him. By dusk, clouds began to crawl over the lake, their underbellies bruised with stormlight. The air grew heavier, charged. Scout paced near the window, whining low, glancing toward the tree line. Ethan checked his phone again. Still no signal. He tried calling Tom one more time, but only static filled the line. He left a voice message anyway. Voice steady but clipped. "Tom, it's Brooks. Everline's not here for land. They're here for what's under it. They've got recovery orders. If you don't hear from me by morning, call someone you trust in Seattle. Tell them Project Tide wasn't buried deep enough." He ended the call, grabbed his jacket, and looked at Scout. "We're not letting them take it, partner." Rain began in thin threads, whispering against the windows. Then the sky split open. Wind howled across the island, shaking the birches until they groaned. The lake turned wild, the surface breaking into angry peaks of white foam. Lightning flickered, lighting the cabin's walls in cold blue flashes. Scout barked once, sharp, urgent, and darted to the back door. Ethan followed with his flashlight. Through the sheets of rain, he saw movement down by the dock. A shadow. No, several. Figures in raincoats, their outlines blurred by water. Ethan's pulse quickened. "They came back," he whispered. He shut off the lights, plunging the cabin into darkness. The storm provided cover now. He watched from the window as one of the figures knelt near the dock, pulling a tarp off something metallic. Another flash of lightning revealed it. A drilling rig, compact, industrial, mounted on a small platform. Scout growled. Ethan tightened his grip on the rifle. "Not tonight," he muttered. He moved, outside, keeping low along the tree line. Rain stung his face, soaking through his jacket in seconds. The sound of the storm drowned everything, perfect for someone who knew how to move unseen. The instincts he'd buried since Afghanistan came back on command. Step between thunderclaps, blend with shadow, breathe with the earth. Scout followed, silent and sure-footed. When they reached the clearing near the dock, Ethan crouched behind a fallen tree. 3 men worked in the downpour, setting up equipment under floodlights powered by a portable generator. Hale wasn't among them, but these weren't contractors. They moved like security. Organized, military-trained. One of them turned toward the woods, and for a heartbeat, the flashlight beam passed right over Ethan's face. He froze. Rain dripped from the brim of his hood, pooling on the rifle barrel. Then thunder cracked, shaking the ground. The man turned away. Scout shifted beside him, tense. Ethan leaned close, whispering, "Stay." He scanned the rig again. The drill was aimed straight down into the earth, right near the spot marked on his grandfather's blueprints. The secondary hatch. He couldn't let them reach it. He crawled back through the mud toward the cabin, rain streaming down his neck. Inside, he grabbed a length of cable from the shed and an old fuel canister from the generator. His plan was simple and dangerous. Disable their equipment before they breached the hatch. When he returned to the clearing, the men were shouting to each other over the storm. The drill's motor whined, grinding against the rock below. Ethan slipped behind their generator, cut the ignition wire, and poured a thin line of fuel into the mud leading away from it. Scout watched from the tree line, eyes bright. "Come on," Ethan muttered, striking the lighter. The small flame hissed in the rain, then caught. Fire snaked across the ground, reaching the generator in seconds. A bright orange bloom flared as the engine coughed and exploded, throwing sparks and shrapnel into the air. The men scattered, shouting. One fell into the mud, clutching his arm. Ethan and Scout darted back into the forest. the glare of the fire lighting the trees behind them. Lightning crashed again, and thunder rolled across the lake. Ethan looked back once to see the drill toppled sideways, flames licking its frame. He thought he saw Hale among the chaos, coat whipping in the wind, shouting orders, but the next flash of light showed only smoke and rain. By the time Ethan and Scout reached the cabin, the fire had dimmed. The storm swallowed everything in gray. Inside, he bolted the door and leaned against it, breathing hard. His hands trembled from adrenaline. Scout pressed against his leg, panting. "You did good," Ethan said softly, running a hand over the dog's soaked fur. "Real good." Thunder cracked again, and something heavy slammed against the back of the house. Ethan spun, rifle ready, the door to the cellar burst open, wind howling through. He rushed down the steps, flashlight flickering. The tunnel door, the steel one, was wide open. Cold air rushed out, smelling of iron and deep earth. Ethan stepped closer. The hatch at the end, the one welded shut, was glowing faintly around the edges, as if something beneath was heating the metal. Scout barked, sharp and panicked. The glow faded just as quickly as it came, leaving only the echo of dripping water. Ethan backed away slowly, locking the door again. His grandfather's words echoed in his mind. The water never rests. Upstairs, the storm roared on. The wind screamed across the island, bending the trees nearly sideways. For hours, thunder rolled and lightning tore through the clouds, painting the lake white with fury. Sometime after midnight, the roof began to leak. Scout's bandaged paw slipped on the wet floor as he tried to follow Ethan patching holes with towels. They were both soaked, exhausted, laughing once just to keep from breaking. When the worst of it finally passed, Ethan collapsed in front of the fire. The storm outside quieted to a soft drizzle. Scout rested his head on his lap, eyes drooping. "Whatever you were protecting, Grandpa," Ethan whispered, staring at the dark window. "I hope you knew what it would cost." Scout sighed in his sleep, tail thumping weakly. Outside, the lake had gone perfectly still again. Too still. The surface reflected the pale dawn light like glass, and somewhere beneath it, something shifted. A slow, deliberate ripple spread outward, fading before it reached the shore. When Ethan finally woke, the rain had stopped, and the island smelled of damp ash and pine. He rose stiffly from the floor, every muscle aching. Scout limped across the cabin, favoring his paw but alert as ever. The night before already felt half like a dream. Fire, thunder, the blast near the dock, that eerie light from the hatch. But the silence this morning was worse. It wasn't peace. It was the kind of silence that waited for something. Ethan poured a bit of water into Scout's bowl and looked out the window. The lake mirrored the gray sky so perfectly, it was impossible to tell where one ended and the other began. He needed to understand what his grandfather had done here, what all of this was for. In the corner of the living room, under a pile of warped floorboards, something metallic caught his eye. He pried the boards loose with a crowbar, and a small wooden chest appeared beneath, its hinges green with rust. It was locked, but a few blows with the handle of his knife broke it open. Inside were papers, a pipe tobacco tin, and a single leather-bound book tied shut with cord. Ethan sat at the table and untied it carefully. On the first page in faded ink was his grandfather's name. Henry A. Brooks, Personal Journal, 1952 to 1954. The handwriting was precise at first, almost clinical. They've called it Project Tide. The idea is simple. Create a sealed fuel system capable of containing volatile compounds indefinitely. The Navy wants storage capacity beneath fresh water, less risk of detection, less chance of corrosion. My designs were approved last week. I should feel proud. But I don't. Ethan turned the page. We finished the primary chamber today. The readings show no leakage, no temperature variation. Still, I can't shake the feeling that something is wrong. The air down there feels alive, like it's breathing through the rock. He kept reading. The later entries changed. The tidy handwriting grew erratic. Words underlined, sentences scratched out. We were told the experiment was to store energy, but I saw the crates unloaded myself. Radioactive emblems, military escort. They lied to us. This isn't a storage project. It's a burial. They're hiding something that should have never been built. Ethan felt the hairs on his arms rise. He flipped through more pages. Dates jumped. Weeks skipped. Orders came to seal the hatch permanently. They say the material stabilized, but I can still hear it hum when the lake freezes. They've abandoned it here, and I'm the one left to keep watch. They told me I was free to leave. I couldn't. I won't. If this place is opened again, it won't be nature that reclaims us. It'll be memory. The last entry stopped mid-sentence. Ink smeared, as though his grandfather's hand had slipped. Scout whined, pressing his muzzle against Ethan's knee. Ethan shut the journal gently, staring at the cover as if it might breathe. "Old man," he murmured, "you weren't guarding a secret. You were guarding a mistake." He looked at Scout. "And now it's ours." A sharp pain lanced through his burned shoulder as he reached for the coffee pot. He winced, flexing his fingers. Scout nudged his leg again, worried. "I'm fine, buddy. Just getting old." A sudden clatter outside made them both jump. Scout barked, low and furious. Ethan grabbed the rifle and stepped to the door. The wind had picked up again, rattling the loose shutters, but the noise wasn't from the weather. It was metal striking wood. He eased the door open. On the porch sat a tin can, rolling back and forth in the breeze. He didn't remember leaving it there. Pinned under it was a note. "You can't stop what's already begun." Ethan's pulse thudded. The writing was neat, deliberate. He looked toward the trees. Nothing moved. No sound. He pocketed the note and turned back inside, bolting the door. By afternoon, the wind returned, sweeping over the lake in heavy bursts. Ethan sat by the fire with the journal open again, reading it aloud quietly, more to fill the silence than anything else. January 1954. Snow tonight. The water beneath the ice glows faintly when the wind stops. I've come to believe it isn't leaking radiation. It's reflecting something that's still active. Maybe not mechanical. Maybe alive. Ethan looked up. "Alive?" he whispered. Scout stirred, ears twitching. Another sound came, this time from the boathouse. A rhythmic thud, metal on metal. Ethan's body tensed instantly. "Stay," he whispered, but Scout ignored him, already halfway to the door. They stepped into the cold dusk. The path to the boathouse was narrow, lined with slick stones and tangled roots. The wind had turned erratic, gusting in strange pulses that made the trees sway like they were breathing. The boathouse door hung slightly open, banging softly in the wind. Inside, the smell of wet wood and decay filled the air. Tools lay scattered across the floor, as though someone had rummaged through them. Ethan swung the flashlight beam slowly across the walls. Then he froze. Footprints. Muddy, barefoot prints leading from the door to the water's edge inside the boathouse, vanishing into the black surface. "Someone's been here," he whispered, but his voice didn't sound like his own. Scout whined and pawed at the floorboards near the waterline. Ethan crouched beside him. The wood was warped, soft. He pried up one of the planks, revealing a narrow gap underneath. Something metallic gleamed below. He lowered the light. A cylindrical object rested in the darkness, smooth, seamless, about a foot wide, with cables or roots wrapped around it. It pulsed faintly, a slow, almost heart-like rhythm. The sight made him dizzy. The hum in the air grew louder until he could feel it in his teeth. He backed away quickly, slamming the plank shut. Scout barked sharply, pulling him back to focus. The noise snapped the moment. The hum stopped. Ethan stumbled out of the boathouse, chest tight, lungs full of cold air. He sat on the steps, gripping his knees, waiting for the shaking to stop. "Whatever that is," he said between breaths, "we're sealing it. No one's ever opening that hatch again." Scout leaned against him, silent and warm. Back inside the cabin, Ethan laid the journal on the table beside the blueprints. Firelight danced across both, making the ink shimmer. His grandfather's words echoed in his mind. "They told me I was free to leave. I couldn't. I won't." Now Ethan understood why Henry Brooks had died alone on this island. Some burdens weren't meant to be shared. He looked at Scout, his one companion against the dark. "We're not leaving either, are we?" Scout tilted his head, eyes calm, loyal. Outside, the wind shifted, carrying across the lake a low, distant rumble that could have been thunder, or something stirring under the water again. Ethan whispered, almost to himself, "The water never rests." And in the dying light of the fire, for a brief second, the metal compass on the table trembled, just enough for him to see it. He stared at it, heart pounding, waiting for another movement, another sound. But the compass stayed still, the needle locked north, glinting faintly in the firelight. Scout lifted his head from where he lay, ears perked. A faint noise crept through the wind, low, mechanical, too steady to belong to the lake. Ethan crossed to the window, brushing aside the curtain. Out beyond the trees, through the veil of fog, a single beam of white light cut across the shore. He killed the lantern and crouched, rifle in hand. The engine noise grew louder now. A motorboat. Scout began to growl, deep and low. Ethan reached down, hand on the dog's neck. "Quiet, boy. Not yet." Through the glass, shapes appeared. 3 of them, moving up from the dock. Their flashlights bobbed across the trail. The men wore dark rain gear, helmets, radios clipped to their shoulders. One carried what looked like a surveying pack, another a rifle slung casually across his back. They stopped near the shed. One of them crouched and examined the scorched ground where Ethan had sabotaged the generator days earlier. The leader straightened, speaking into his radio, though the wind swallowed his words. Ethan's pulse quickened. Whoever they weren't here to negotiate. Hale had made good on his threat. He waited until they disappeared behind the trees, then slipped on his jacket, motioning to Scout. "Let's move." They circled wide through the woods, keeping low. The air smelled of wet moss and gasoline. Through the branches, Ethan caught glimpses of the men's flashlights sweeping across the property, their beams cutting through the mist like blades. One of the intruders stopped beside the house, scanning the windows. His flashlight paused on the front door, then moved on. The leader's voice was sharper now, closer. "Check the house. We'll find the documents first." Scout tensed beside him. Ethan's mind raced. There was no way to confront 3 armed men head-on, not with Scout still recovering from his injured paw. He needed to outthink them. He slipped deeper into the woods, toward the dock. If he could cut their way out, they'd be trapped on the island. Rain began to fall again, thin needles against the leaves. The sound masked his footsteps. Scout moved like a shadow beside him, ears low. At the water's edge, Ethan crouched beside the dock's mooring post. The intruder's boat was tied loosely, its engine humming softly. He untied the rope, let it drift, and gave it a small push. The current carried it quietly into the fog until it was gone. He turned to leave, and froze. A flashlight beam snapped on, blinding him. "Don't move!" A man's voice, sharp, trained. Ethan blinked through the glare. The man from the dock stepped closer, rifle raised. "Hands where I can see them." Scout growled behind him, teeth bared. The man glanced down, smirking. "Nice dog. Bet he bites." Ethan's hands lifted slowly. What do you want? The man's grin didn't change. Same thing your granddad wanted, I suppose. What's buried under this island? Before Ethan could speak, Scout lunged. The man fired once, the muzzle flash lighting the fog like lightning. The bullet missed. Scout hit the man square in the chest, knocking him backward into the mud. The rifle went skidding into the lake. Ethan grabbed the man's radio and smashed it against a rock before he could call for help. Scout stood over him, teeth bared, growling. The man coughed, clutching his chest. You don't know what's down there. Ethan leaned closer, his voice calm but cold. I know enough to keep it there. The man laughed weakly. You can't stop it. They're already digging. Ethan looked up. Through the fog, he could see faint orange glows flickering near the hill, torches or floodlights. The other two men had started excavation near the hatch. He tied the man's hands with his belt and left him by the dock, then sprinted toward the hill, Scout beside him. The rain thickened, turning to a steady sheet. Every breath burned in his chest as he climbed. At the top, the sight froze him. The hatch, the same steel door from the tunnel, was open. The men had forced it wide using crowbars and drills. Steam rose from the opening, curling into the cold air. The two intruders stood over it, their gear scattered, the light from their lamps flickering across the wet metal. One of them was shouting into his radio, the words broken by static. We've breached containment. Readings are off the chart. Ethan stepped out from behind the trees, rifle raised. Drop it! The men spun, startled. One lifted his weapon, but Scout was faster. The dog barreled into him, knocking him to the ground. The second man fired, the bullet sparking off the hatch. Ethan fired back, hitting the dirt near his feet. The man stumbled, dropped his gun, and ran toward the shoreline. The wind howled louder now, carrying a low moan that didn't sound like the storm. Ethan turned toward the open hatch. A dim light pulsed from below, slow, rhythmic, like the beat of a heart. The sound that came with it vibrated in his bones, deep and wrong. He felt dizzy, disoriented. The ground beneath his feet seemed to hum. Scout whined, backing away from the opening. Come on, boy, Ethan said, grabbing the dog's collar. We're sealing it. He grabbed the nearest crowbar and jammed it under the steel frame, pushing with all his strength. The lid groaned but didn't budge. The light below flared brighter, spilling pale blue across the mud. For a moment, he saw something moving inside the chamber, something fluid, twisting like smoke under glass. Then the light blinked out. Ethan slammed the hatch shut. The sound echoed across the island like a cannon. He twisted the locking bar into place, breathing hard, rain pouring down his face. Scout barked once, loud and sharp. Ethan turned. The man who had run toward the shoreline was gone, but his boat wasn't. It had drifted back, bumping softly against the dock. He didn't wait to understand how. He and Scout retreated to the cabin, soaked and shaking. He barricaded the door with furniture, then sank against the wall, rifle across his knees. Scout lay beside him, chest heaving. From somewhere out in the darkness came the faint echo of engines. More boats. Ethan whispered, "They're coming back with more." Scout pressed closer, his eyes glowing in the dim firelight as thunder rolled over the lake again. Ethan looked toward the table where the journal and compass lay. The compass needle spun wildly, trembling until it stopped, pointing straight toward the sealed hatch. And deep under the lake, the hum started again. The sound wasn't loud, but it was constant. A vibration felt more in the chest than in the ears. The cabin's glass panes shivered, the flames in the hearth fluttered sideways. Scout growled softly, his gaze fixed on the floorboards as though he could see through them. Ethan rose to his feet, every instinct screaming to run, to take the boat and leave the island behind. But something stronger kept him rooted. His grandfather's words haunted him like a whisper in the storm. If this place is opened again, it won't be nature that reclaims us. It'll be memory. He grabbed the journal from the table, flipping through pages until he found the last legible note. Should anything breach containment, fire is the only remedy. Water will feed it, cold will slow it, but only fire will end it. Ethan stared at the words, his throat tight. Fire, he muttered. That's what you meant. Outside, a new light flickered through the fog. Orange, dancing, alive. He hurried to the window and froze. The hill above the hatch was burning. The flames cut through the darkness like a wound in the night. Someone had set it ablaze. Scout barked once, sharp and urgent. Ethan grabbed his rifle, shoved extra rounds into his jacket pocket, and ran into the rain. The fire was spreading fast, licking up the trunks of pine trees, throwing sparks into the wind. The smell of smoke hit him, sharp and bitter, mixing with the wet air. Hail, he growled. Through the smoke he saw movement, 2 men running toward the dock. One of them carried a fuel canister, the other a flare gun. They'd set the fire to flush him out, or to cover their tracks. Either way, they didn't expect him to be running toward it. Ethan shouted, "Stop! You'll burn the whole island!" The man with the flare gun turned. His voice carried across the wind. "That's the point!" He fired. The flare screamed through the rain, hit the ground near Ethan, and exploded in a burst of red fire. Scout lunged forward, barking furiously, forcing the men to retreat toward the shoreline. Ethan dove for cover behind a fallen tree, coughing through the smoke. Heat rippled across his face. He could barely see, the air thick with ash and rain. The men were gone by the time he stood again, their motorboat already roaring across the lake, taillights fading into the mist. The fire was spreading downhill now, toward the cabin. The rain wasn't enough to stop it. Sparks leapt from branch to branch, carried by the wind. Ethan turned to run back, but Scout wasn't following. The dog was pawing at something buried near the path, the edge of the hatch. "What is it, boy?" Scout barked, then whimpered, backing away. The ground near the hatch was shaking, soil crumbling, heat rising from below. The hum was louder now, deep enough to rattle Ethan's bones. He knelt, shining his flashlight across the steel surface. Thin cracks glowed faintly red, pulsing like veins under skin. He remembered his grandfather's note again. Fire is the only remedy. "All right," Ethan whispered, gripping the flashlight until his knuckles went white. "Then we end it." He ran back to the cabin, coughing through smoke, Scout limping behind him. Inside, he grabbed the old kerosene lamp from the shelf, a half-full gas can from the shed, and the pack of road flares he'd found in the Jeep. "Come on, buddy," he said, voice rough. "We're finishing this." The air outside was suffocating, smoke and heat rising together, turning the world into a blur of gold and black. Ethan poured the fuel around the hatch's edges, then struck a flare. The red light flared to life, reflecting off Scout's eyes. "Go," Ethan said, pointing toward the trees. "Get back!" But Scout stayed beside him, trembling but unmoving. "Go!" Ethan shouted. The dog didn't move. Ethan dropped the flare. For a heartbeat, nothing happened. Then the ground erupted in light and sound. Flames surged upward, orange and blue, swallowing the steel hatch, devouring the leaking air that hissed out from beneath. The explosion threw Ethan backward into the mud. The sky itself seemed to crack open. He hit the ground hard, ears ringing. The heat washed over him in waves. Scout was beside him, whimpering, one paw scraped and bleeding. "Easy, easy," Ethan said, pulling the dog into his arms. "We did it." The flames roared higher, licking at the trees. The sound from below faded, replaced by the crackle of burning wood. The glow beneath the hatch finally dimmed, the cracks cooling from red to dull gray. But the victory felt hollow. The island was still burning. The fire was spreading toward the cabin. Ethan dragged Scout to his feet and half carried him down the slope, coughing, vision swimming. The air shimmered with heat. He could barely see the dock through the haze. The boat Hale had abandoned earlier was still there, bumping softly against the pier. He stumbled onto the deck, Scout collapsing beside him. He cut the rope and pushed off, the oars creaking as he rowed away from the island. The fire behind him grew into a living thing, an inferno reflected in the lake's glassy surface. The whole island looked like it was breathing flame. When they reached the center of the lake, Ethan stopped rowing. His arms shook from exhaustion. The rain began again, hissing as it met the fire. Steam rose from the trees in long, ghostly tendrils. Scout lay at his feet, chest rising and falling slowly. Ethan touched the dog's head gently, whispering, "You're all right, boy. You're all right." He looked back at the burning island, eyes stinging from smoke. He thought of Henry Brooks, sitting alone in that cabin decades ago, knowing what he'd hidden would someday wake again. "You were right, Grandpa," he whispered. "Fire's the only way to make it stop." The rain thickened until the world turned gray again. The flames shrank to dull embers, then vanished beneath a curtain of smoke. The hum was gone. The lake lay silent. For the first time since he'd arrived, Ethan felt the island truly rest. He looked down at his burned hands, the skin blistered, the blood mixing with rainwater. Scout shifted, pressing his muzzle against Ethan's arm. "It's over," Ethan said softly. "We did what he couldn't." But even as the words left his mouth, he saw something in the distance, through the fading mist. The faint outline of another motorboat approaching, its light cutting across the dark water. Hale. Ethan gripped the oars again, exhaustion forgotten. "Not yet, boy," he whispered. "We're not done." He rowed back toward the island's smoking shore, the sound of the approaching engine growing louder with every pull. The rain pounded against the lake, blurring the horizon into a smear of gray and firelight. Scout shifted at his feet, trying to stand despite the limp in his paw. The closer they came, the more Ethan could see of the destruction he'd left behind. The hillside was blackened, trees still crackling with ember light. Smoke rose in thin columns curling into the rain. The air smelled of burnt pine and gasoline. And near the dock, cutting through the fog, was the white motorboat. Its engine idled low, prow pointing toward the shore like a drawn blade. Hale stood at the bow. Even from a distance, Ethan could see his pale face under the brim of his slicked hat, calm and unreadable. He raised a hand, signaling. Two men stepped out from behind him, armed, dressed in dark tactical gear, rifles glinting in the rain. Ethan pulled the oars faster, guiding the small rowboat into the shadow of a fallen pine. He dragged it halfway onto the sand and crouched low, Scout beside him, both breathing hard. "Stay down," he whispered. The motorboat drew closer until it scraped softly against the dock. Hale stepped out first, adjusting his coat as though he were arriving for a business meeting rather than a confrontation. His men followed, sweeping the area with flashlights. "Mr. Brooks!" Hale's voice carried easily over the rain. "I see you've been busy." Ethan didn't answer. He slid behind the trunk of the burned tree, mud squelching under his boots. The rain hissed as it hit the embers around him. "I warned you this would happen," Hale continued. "You can't hide something this valuable forever. But I'll give you one last chance to walk away. Let my men collect what remains, and we'll leave you your life." Scout growled low, his teeth flashing white in the dark. Ethan steadied his breathing, lining up his sights through the gap between two branches. Hale was 30 yards away, standing just in front of the cabin's porch. The faint orange glow from the dying firelight painted his face. "You talk too much," Ethan muttered under his breath. He fired once. The bullet hit the wooden post beside Hale, splintering it. The men dove for cover, shouting. Hale didn't flinch. He only turned slowly toward Ethan's direction, voice cold. So be it. Gunfire erupted. Bullets tore through the trees, spitting mud and bark. Ethan ducked low, rolling behind the next trunk, returning fire in short bursts. The smell of cordite filled the rain-soaked air. Scout barked furiously, darting between cover, drawing the men's attention long enough for Ethan to reposition. The firefight raged for minutes that felt like hours. One of Hale's men went down, screaming as his leg buckled under a shot. The other retreated, toward the dock, firing wildly. Hale stayed back, shouting orders, his composure finally cracking. Ethan slid behind the wreckage of a fallen beam, breath ragged, rifle empty. He reached for another clip and realized he was out. He looked at Scout. The dog's flank was bleeding, a shallow graze, but he was still moving, still ready. Ethan gritted his teeth. "All right, buddy," he whispered. "One last push." He tore a strip from his sleeve, tied it around Scout's leg to slow the bleeding, then picked up a half-empty fuel canister from the ground, the one he'd dropped earlier near the shed. An idea sparked in his mind. He poured a trail of fuel through the mud, leading toward the dock. Then he grabbed a flare from his belt, twisted it until the red light burst alive, and shoved it into the ground. "Come on!" he shouted, stepping out of cover. Hale spun toward the light. "Brooks, don't be stupid!" Ethan fired a single shot into the fuel line. The explosion ripped across the shoreline, fire erupting in a chain reaction that sent one of the boats flipping onto its side. The blast threw Hale backward into the mud. The air burned with heat and thunder. Scout barked wildly, circling back to Ethan's side as flaming debris rained around them. Ethan staggered, ears ringing, vision spinning. Through the haze he saw Hale crawling toward the cabin, his once white coat now black with ash. "Stop!" Ethan shouted, voice hoarse. "It's over!" But Hale didn't stop. He reached the porch, pulling something from his jacket, a small detonator. He turned, smiling through the soot. "You think this ends with you?" he said. "You think you burned it all?" Ethan raised his rifle, but before he could pull the trigger, Hale pressed the button. A deep rumble shook the ground. The hatch, buried beneath layers of ash and mud, split open again. Fire and smoke poured from the fissure, the earth groaning like something alive beneath it. The blast knocked Ethan off his feet. Scout tumbled beside him, yelping. When the ringing in his ears cleared, all he could hear was the roar of the fire and the collapsing groan of the hillside. Hale was gone, swallowed by the smoke and rubble. Ethan crawled to Scout, pulling him close. "Hold on, boy. Stay with me." The ground shuddered once more, then went still. The rain returned, heavy and relentless, dousing the flames, cooling the soil until steam rose in great white columns. The world around them dimmed into silence again. Ethan lay there, drenched and shaking, holding the dog close. When the smoke cleared, all that remained of the cabin was its stone foundation and the twisted frame of the porch. The hatch was gone, buried for good this time under tons of earth and fallen timber. He pressed a hand to Scout's side, feeling the dog's breath steady beneath his palm. "You're all right," he murmured. "We made it." In the distance, the faint wail of sirens drifted across the Sisset lake, probably the mainland fire department answering reports of the explosion. Ethan looked toward the gray horizon where the water met the sky. The compass, somehow still in his pocket, had cracked, its needle frozen pointing downward. He turned it once, then threw it into the lake. It vanished without a sound. Scout whined softly. Ethan smiled faintly, exhaustion settling over him like a blanket. "It's done," he said. "It's finally done." As dawn broke, the rain eased to a drizzle. The first light of morning touched the charred island, glinting off wet stone and the slow rise of mist. Ethan leaned against the wreckage of the dock, Scout resting his head on his knee. For the first time since he'd arrived, there was no hum, no flicker beneath the water. just quiet. The kind of quiet that meant peace, not warning. And though his body ached and his lungs burned, Ethan found himself smiling through it. He'd kept his grandfather's promise. He looked at Scout. "We'll rebuild, huh?" The dog wagged his tail weakly, eyes half closed, as the soft wind rippled over the lake like a sigh. Morning settled slow over the ruins. Thin light seeped through the clouds, painting the wet ground in muted gold. Steam still rose from the scorched soil, curling around the blackened remains of the cabin. The smell of ash clung to the air, a quiet reminder of everything they had endured. Ethan sat beside the broken dock, boots half submerged in the shallows. Scout rested with his head on Ethan's leg, eyes fluttering shut and open again, too tired to sleep. Ethan ran a hand over the dog's fur, rough from smoke and rain, and let out a long, shaky breath. For the first time since he'd come to the island, the silence didn't feel like a warning. It felt like relief. The faint wail of sirens had faded hours ago, replaced by birdsong. Somewhere in the woods, a single loon called out over the lake, its echo soft and haunting. Ethan turned the burned compass over in his hand. The glass was cracked, the needle frozen, but it no longer pointed downward. For some reason, that made him smile. He placed it gently on the dock beside him. Behind him, the remnants of the cabin smoldered faintly. What had once been walls and windows were now just a skeleton of charred beams. But the foundation still stood, solid stone, stubborn as the man who had built it. Henry Brooks had known what he was doing when he chose this place. "Guess you were right, old man," Ethan murmured. "Some things have to burn before they can breathe again." Scout whined softly, shifting his head to look up at him. Ethan smiled. "Yeah, I know. We'll start over." He stood, joints aching, and limped toward what was left of the cabin. Rain had pooled in the blackened corners, reflecting the morning light. He found a section of roof beam still intact and used it to prop up a temporary shelter. It wasn't much, but it gave them shade and a place to rest. From the debris, he salvaged what he could: a half-burned journal, a rusted kettle, and one of his grandfather's old photographs, the one of Henry standing beside the young boy. The edges were singed, the image faded, but the two faces were still there, faint but defiant. He wiped the soot away and tucked it carefully into his pack. By midday, the clouds had lifted. The lake lay calm again, its surface smooth as glass. The hum that had once haunted the air was gone completely. Whatever had been buried beneath the island was silent now, sealed by fire, perhaps forever. Ethan knelt by the water's edge and filled a canteen, watching the ripples spread across the surface. Each one faded gently, as if the island itself was breathing slower, easier. "Maybe it's finally over," he said quietly. Scout lapped at the water beside him, then looked up with bright, trusting eyes. Ethan smiled. "You hungry, partner?" The dog's ears perked at the word. Ethan chuckled, rummaging through his pack for one of the last cans of rations. They ate together in the soft warmth of the afternoon, surrounded by the slow sounds of the world returning to itself. Dripping water, birds, the rustle of branches in the wind. Later, Ethan found a patch of unburned soil near the old oak at the hill's edge, the same one that had shaded the cabin porch. He dug a small hole with his hands, ignoring the sting in his palms, and buried the metal tin containing Henry's letters and blueprints. Over it, he placed a smooth, flat stone, carving into it with his knife, for those who kept the secret. He sat there for a while, looking out over the lake, feeling the weight of the past settle into stillness. That evening, when the sun dipped low and turned the water to gold, Ethan built a small fire on the dock, just enough to keep them warm. Scout curled up beside him, breathing slow and steady. Ethan pulled out a piece of paper from his notebook and began to write by the flickering light. Tom, if you ever get this, don't come looking. There's nothing left to find here except what was meant to stay buried. I did what had to be done. Maybe that makes me like him, like Henry. I guess some blood debts don't end, they just pass on to the next fool who thinks he can make things right. But the island's quiet now. That's enough for me. E. He folded the note carefully, slipped it into a glass jar, and sealed it. He placed the jar in the ashes of the fire, covering it with a plank from the old porch. When he turned back to the water, the first stars had begun to appear. Their reflections shimmered on the lake, merging with the faint glow of the moon. Ethan sat there until his eyes grew heavy, until the rhythm of the waves felt like breathing again, steady, patient, alive. Scout nudged his arm once as if to say it's okay now, before resting his head on Ethan's knee. Yeah, Ethan whispered. It's okay. He looked toward the horizon, where the dark outline of the island met the endless stretch of sky. The air was cool, sweet with pine and rain. Somewhere out there, beyond the fog, the world kept moving. But here, on this quiet patch of earth, everything had stopped just long enough for peace to finally take hold. Ethan leaned back against the post, watching the last of the smoke drift away into the stars. The water never rests, he murmured. But maybe we can. Scout's tail thumped once against the wood in reply. And as the night deepened, the lake breathed softly around them, steady and endless, like the heart of the world itself, carrying the echoes of a promise that had finally been kept. If this story moved you, take a second to let me know. Drop a simple 1 in the comments so I know you're still here, listening by the fire with us. And if you'd like to walk beside more stories like this, tales of courage, loss, and the bond that never breaks, make sure to subscribe before you go, because the next story is already waiting out there, somewhere in the dark.